And then going to go through what we call best practices, what we suggest customers do in their environment. And then there's going to be show and tell. There's going to be a lot of show and tell. I'm going to do demos. And some of these demos might seem trivial and very easy, but they're going to be building up, so they're going to get more and more complex towards the end. And they're building on each other, so bear with me. And some demos I'm actually going to skip for sake of time, probably. So what is IAM, or AWS IAM? Shouldn't be a surprise. It gives you as a customer control of who does what in your environment. You can go and control very specifically the bits and pieces, and you manage it centrally. Primitives, you should be familiar with these if you're using any other operating systems. We have users, we have groups, we have permissions. We have something we call roles that I'll get into a little bit later on in the presentation. But it's a primitive that can be used for controlling access into your environment. It's centralized. So it's in one place you control access to all the services that we support, S3, EC2, SimpleDB, all the services that we have in our portfolio, you control access in one place, and that is in IAM. It's very fine-grained. You could do it down to APIs or actions, as we call them. You could do it down to a resource, a very specific resource. And you can also control if they can either call APIs or use the console or both. Security, secure by default. If you create a principal or a user in our environment, they cannot do anything in your account unless you've granted them permissions. Creating a user is just creating a row in a table in a database. That's all it does. It doesn't give you any permissions to do anything. You have to specifically grant them what they can do in the environment, or specifically deny them if you want to do that as well. You can create multiple users. You create a user per individual that's going to use your environment or access your environment. You can give them individual security credentials. We'll talk a little bit more what security credentials are in our future slides. And you can have individual permissions. Or through groups, give same set of users the same set of permissions. So overall, shouldn't be anything new if you're using other operating systems. It's fairly similar, and that's what we strive for as well. It's not that it's over-innovative, what it is. You should be used to these terms, these terminologies, and these way of controlling things. It's just the way we provide them in AWS. So, top 10 best practices. This is the list we're going to go through. I'm going to go through them one by one. And most of them are going to be a little bit of a demo to drive through, see how you do it, how you usually set things up. And for those that are very quick looking at it, they realized there's an error up there. It's not top 10, it's actually 11. And we based it a little bit on a zero-based coding error, but. Create users. Benefits. It's nothing new here. Everybody knows about it. You can create individual users. You create a user per individual or per application, if you want to call it, that's going to call into your AWS environment using their individual credentials. So in our world, there are two sets of credentials. A user can have a password, which is normally what you have when you sign into your laptop. Nothing new there. But you also have access keys. And access keys are used when you are interacting with APIs directly. You write your own application, you're calling to an API, you sign those requests using access keys. So two set of credentials, and you control which set of credentials the user has. It's a way of controlling what they can do. Individual permissions, this is where you can go to control and be very specific what each user does. Anders can go in and read a very specific table in DynamoDB, but he can't do anything else, as an example. So how do you get started? Well, of course, you identify who needs an IAM user. What are the users you need to create? First step in the row. Then after that, we provide a number of tools for you to get started. We have the console. We also have a command line interface that you can use if you prefer that way, or you can write your own application, write your own little console that does these things and call our APIs. For the sake of the rest of the demo, for the rest of the presentation, I will be using the console as a way of showing off all the demos. So let's see if we can get this working. First demo, let's create a user. So as you see in here, I already have a user, it's Anders, that's who I'm signed in as. And I'm going to use that as my admin, but I'm going to go and create a new user. And it's pretty straightforward. You create a user. This says he's going to get an access key. I'm going to take this away. I don't want this guy to have access keys. Let's call him for the sake of argument, let's call him Bob. Bob's created. I do want Bob to be able to go in and set up, change his to be able to sign into the console. So let's give them a password. And yes, you noticed I did not go in and force him to change his password. Now, if we sign in as Bob, easily I come in, but as you see, I don't have anything. I can't do anything. There's no permissions for me to do anything within the environment. If I select EC2, which is our compute environment, same thing here. There's no permissions. S3 is another example where I have all my buckets. Anything that I want to store that's on file exists in my S3 environment. When it comes up, so actually, I don't have permissions. So users create it. He has access. He has a set of credentials, but he can't do anything, right? So back to the presentation. Also, the way we also suggest is that you manage permissions through groups, and this is sort of like also pretty straightforward. There's nothing new here from anywhere else. Even if you only got one user that's going to have permissions, you usually suggest that you use groups. Reason for that is, reason for that is to be able to, if somebody else needs the same permissions, you just add them to the group. Easier for you to manage and simpler to reassign as well. You just move users between groups when you want to give them different types of permissions. I saw a hand raised down there. So.
Do you want to take questions now?
If I can, I prefer taking them later if it's okay with you. We'll take them at the end. So how do you get started? You map permissions to business function, nothing different from what you would do in your enterprise. You're setting it up in your OS. You assign users to that group, and you manage the groups in the console as well as you did previously. So let's go back to the console that we had and quickly create a group. Now, I need to, since Bob can't do anything, I need to sign in as Anders again. And usually what we've seen from our customers that most actually manage this stuff through the console. It's easiest to do, it's point and click, and it's pretty straightforward. So as you can see, I've got a number of groups in here. I'm going to create a new group that I'm going to call S3 read only. And for sake of this demo, I'm going to say it doesn't have any permissions at all. Create the group. So I can S3 read only. If you said there's no permissions in here, I'm going to add users to it. I'm going to go and add Bob into the group. All's nice and dandy. I have a group. I have Bob in the group, but that's about it. I don't have any permissions assigned to it. And this gets back to the next. I'm not going to sign in as Bob yet, so I'm going to go into this presentation and continue because that is a follow-on on this one. Least privilege. This is a strong recommendation we do is make sure you give your users least privilege or manage through least privilege. Don't give them all the access you want just for it's easier to do it that way. At some point, somebody will do something that they didn't intend to do, but they just were able to do it because they had more permissions than necessary. And it's usually easier to relax permissions than actually trying to tighten it down. So it's a strong recommendation to go down this path. And this is where I talked about least privilege. One thing I talked about previously was password and access keys. So as you notice, when I created Bob, I never gave him access keys. So even though if I give Bob permissions to do things within my account, he cannot create an application and call in. He can only access this through the console. And vice versa, I can do something where I don't give password, I just use access keys to interact with. That's another way of looking at least privilege. Don't assign full access. We call it star in our terminology or in our documentation. That basically gives the user root or administrator in the Windows terms. They can do anything in that case. Yes, it's easy, they can get going and they can work on things, but they can also do things that you might not want them to do. Rather, lock it down as much as you can and then from there on, continue on and open up if necessary if they need more access. An easy way to get started as well is use policy templates. So we provide a lot of templates for you to get started. You can take those templates and then you go in and customize them over time as you want, as you see fit. But they're a good way of getting started, giving your users the right permissions. So let's go back, and I had this group, and let's give him attach a policy. And we said S3 read only. I know that it happens to be at the very end somewhere. There we go. And this is what a policy looks like. I haven't gone into the detail, but I'm not going to dive into these in more detail other than showing what it is. But essentially what this says is for S3, which is the service, these are the APIs. Anything that starts with list, anything that starts with get, basically read APIs, I'm going to allow anybody that has this policy attached to them. So if I now, once again, sign in as Bob, the same thing you can see, I don't have any access to the IAM console. I tried EC2, I don't have any access here either because that's not what the policy allows. But if I now go to the S3 console, I'll have access to be able to read and see what's in the console. I can see the buckets. I can go and read the contents in the buckets, but I can't do anything. I can't delete anything in those buckets. You see now I actually have access. Previously said access denied, and I can see them. I can drill down into the bits and pieces. The secret project has some folders in it. And no, there's no secrets here. I'm not going to resolve anything, divulge anything. It's just a name of the bucket. Back to the presentation. So it's been pretty straightforward. Like create a user, create a group, make sure you've managed the least privilege, make sure you configure a password, strong password. This is also something that you normally do within your environment. Make sure the users have strong passwords, especially if they're users with more permissions than you might, to do things that you might be worried about. Key thing here is to know, like when you look at what your company's password policy is, and you take that and create your rules around. We give you a fair amount of pieces to configure, and for those that have been using this for a while, I don't know if you know, but last week we actually announced some enhancement in this space. Previously, you can only go in and control, like the first two bullets, minimum password length, and also requiring any combination of the uppercase, lowercase. You can now also go in and configure password age, so basically force a password reset, force the user to go in and reset their password. And also control the password history, the number of password you will remember. So you sort of like get the normal way of going and controlling, making sure there's a rotation of the secrets of the user. And same thing here. Let's go in. And quickly, you're going to see the login screen a couple of times here because I got to go a little bit back and forth, but. So when you notice here, there's something that says password policy. This is where I can go in and control what I want a user's password to be, and I can be fairly restrictive if I want to. So I can go in and say, in this case, at least I want a lowercase letter, I want 6 letters in the password. I want to enable password expiration. Let's say I'll do it every 90 days to be a nice guy, and I apply the policy. And this is now set, so it applies to all the users in your environment. And it also allows them to go in and change their policy. I don't know if anybody noticed this, but this little thing here. So as I said previously, it is secure by default. A user cannot change his password or rotate his access keys unless you specifically grant them that permission. We're true to the whole point of staying secure by default from start. The other thing you can do as well, we now set it up so something that is enforced across the board. If we now pick Bob as a user, we go in on a security credential and pick manage password again. I'll let him keep his password, but I'm actually going to require him to change the password when he signs in the next time. So now, real quick, let's sign in as Bob again. And I try to sign in with my password, and so I got my password here. Let's try and set the same password again. Oh, actually, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to just set the old one. Set a different one. And that just simply lets me in. So it's a way of easily forcing it. This is something that we released, I said, at least about a week ago. For those of you that have been using AWS previously, we know this was a pain point where there was no way of forcing this to actually happen. Now you can do it across the board, which is a good thing. The next piece I'm going to talk about is MFA. So multi-factor authentication. So a lot of things you've seen up to now, like everybody sitting there, you're usually reading your email, you're looking at your phone because it's bread and butter, right? What do you do with a normal operating system? There's nothing new in what we've just talked about compared to any operating system. MFA isn't really either, but actually something now you can set up in the environment. You can control it in different ways. You can use MFA to control access through the console. You require them to sign in with an Mfa device, authenticate with an Mfa device as part of their sign-in process. You can also require MFA on a per API basis or even a per resource basis. And you do that through policy, which I will get to a little bit later. So supplements using a password. There's different types of MFA we support. We call them virtual MFAs. This is basically you use your phone. There's hardware MFAs. There's a token. There's also a credit card size, a credit card one. I don't have one up with me up here right now, but if you're interested, you can come up afterwards and I'll show you one, what it looks like. And it's Gemalto, who is the manufacturer that provides these. And the way you set this up is, once again, you set it up through the IAM console. And I'll quickly show this. And I'll give a heads up for those that have a smartphone and have a camera on them. You can now get a QR code and try to see if you can steal my account. There's usually somebody that does, or tries to. So you select user, you select the user per se, you go in, and here there is a button that says Manage MFA Device. And I want a virtual MFA. And now I need to pick up my phone. I need to enter 2 codes. Usually there's people that shout out the codes to me so I don't have to type them. Now we have to wait a little bit. So they have to provide 2 codes in between. So it's time-based. So it needs to go in to synchronize the codes back in the server. So let's wait for the second code. It's about 30 seconds. And this is where it's up to you how you pick and choose. Some people, some companies are okay with using smartphones, while others are more security conscious and they really want to use hardware devices. So if I try now, it basically tells me that this is not going to work. Use the same password as previously, so I have to go in, say that I have an MFA. My phone went to sleep, I apologize. Now it's an MFA. So this you can assign to any user you have in there. Usually what you do is you assign it to privileged users, anybody that has access to information that's sensitive, like instances that are running your production environment, and you want to ensure that they're not basically giving away the keys to the castle. So strongly recommended setting this up for any user that has what you consider being privileged permissions. And I'm not going to define what those are. That's something you have to figure out yourself in your own environment. Auditing. So we're going in, we define users, we create groups, we set permissions, they go in and do a bunch of stuff in your environment. How do you know what they've done? How do you know what they've tried to do? This is where CloudTrail comes in, or the auditing technology that we have. And it's fairly easy to set up. You basically have to identify an S3 bucket that you want to have your files written to. And you can have the same S3 bucket for all the accounts that you have in your environment. If you have more than one account, they can all write to the same place. And all you do is you enable AWS CloudTrail in the console. And quickly doing this, You see it's turned off, so I'm going to click Edit here real quick just to show the things you're going to change. So you can either create a new bucket or you can take an existing one. This is a bucket I created, so I'm going to be using that. It asks for a log prefix. It's more like how to identify where you want to write it. You could pick whatever you want. It's up to you how you define those pieces. Global services, these are services that are not region-specific, but part of what it does, it logs the calls from each region in a specific path, so you can actually distinguish them and see them that way. And the global ones get logged in all places. You can get notifications when there's a new file available. And let's just do save and turn on. And I'm done. I've turned it on. Don't have to do much more than this. It's now writing files to my bucket. Now, if we go in to S3 real quick, and apparently the S3 console isn't real quick. My bucket that I called CIS 2014. Let's drill down here and see what we can find. Logs. This is the account ID of my account, the one that I'm signed into. This is where you would see multiple account IDs if you're using them for different accounts. It's a CloudTrail, of course. That's the region, 2014, in July. It's today. And here's a lot of files of entries. And let's just pick one right here randomly. And I think this is fully readable in the back. Everybody fully understands what this does? No. So there's a lot of partners that provide tools that help you read and deal with this. What I have here is a simple JSON tool that allows you to go in and basically you can go in and look at bits and pieces. I just want to bring it up so you can see. So you can see information here at the detail of what the pieces are, what's content in there. I'd rather recommend you use a partner like Splunk or something like that. They actually give very nice views on top of this, and you can angle it any way you want. But if you want to read the raw JSON, be our guest. This is what I read every morning when I have coffee, so. Nah, I'm just joking.
No, he's not.
So up till now, everything you've seen so far that I talked about has been, and sounding like a broken record, there's nothing specific in it to what AWS does. It should be very familiar. If you've used Windows or Linux, it's the same thing. As users, there's groups, there's permissions. You're going to define, make sure it's least privilege. You want an audit trail. Now we're getting into some of the pieces where we start talking about best practice on things that are unique to AWS. One of them is roles. And the first thing we're going to talk about is roles for EC2. So what is roles for EC2s? So there's a number of people in here that were using AWS. How many of you are using EC2? A couple of you. Do you have applications running on EC2 talking to other services? 1, 2. Do you use roles for EC2? Apparently not. Do I have a Christmas present for you guys? So roles for EC2, the thing that it solves is that if you've got an EC2 instance, our compute environment, you run up an instance that has Windows or Linux or some other operating system on it. And you've got an application running on that instance that you want to talk to some other service, say S3 as an example. Somehow you need to get access keys out to that instance so you can sign the requests. Well, that's what roles for EC2, that's what it solves. It is an easy way of getting credentials out there without you having to figure out a secure way of getting them out there, or how to rotate keys, or what are the deals that I need to do around it. We've built all that and taken all that muck away from you guys. How do you get started? It's easy. You create a role. You go in and define the permissions on the role. So you definitely, through a role, define what are the applications on my instance that are running are going to be able to do. You launch the instance with a role, and if you built your application using the AWS SDK, you don't have to worry anything about access keys or the credentials. The SDK will take care of that for you. And we rotate the credentials on the instance several times a day. So you get automatic key rotation. So you get something that is simpler than you have today, and it's probably more secure than trying to figure it out. And there's a whole session coming later on this after me. There's 2 sessions that are going. One is going to talk about delegation. That's going to cover this in more detail. And there's a second one that's going to talk more about federation. That goes even more into detail. It talks about roles. So I'm actually going to skip the demo on this. It's going to come later. Sharing. So a fair amount of customers have more than one account. They've created that for various reasons, either because they have a prod environment and a dev environment and want to keep them isolated. But at the same time, they want to share data in between. There might be the developer sitting in the dev environment need access to the production environment to be able to validate that something's going on or going in and looking at what actually is happening. And we've seen customers, and one of the reasons we're going to go through this is that we've seen customers where they share credentials, they share the access keys, they send them an email, or they share a password, basically put it on a sticky note and share it. Not the most secure way of giving people access into your environment. This is where roles come in again. So it's an interesting primitive. A role in itself, which I haven't covered yet, is a principal such as a user. The biggest difference between a user and a role is a role does not have long-term credentials. You cannot assign credentials to a role. They get assigned at runtime, and they're temporary, and they will expire after a certain interval, right? But at the same time, it is a principal. You assign it permissions like you do a user the same way. You deal with the same way you create the role. Why would you use roles for sharing? Well, number one, easy to create. Number two, you can easily break a relationship, and you don't have to share secrets. That's a big thing. Use cases, there's 3 of them listed, cross-account access, intra-account delegation. You might want to delegate access to somebody internally in the account for a temporary period. You can use roles for that as well. And for federation. And I'm not going to dive into details on these. It's going to come later on in the following presentations, which I encourage you guys to go to. Same thing as with EC2, you create the role. There's a little bit of a difference with regards to roles for EC2. This is where you actually have to specify who do you trust. Who is allowed to assume the role? Who is allowed to take a peek into your account? You have to specify that in a policy. And secondly, you need to specify what the role can do. This is the same as you had with the roles for EC2. And once you've created this, you can send the name of the role to the person that you want to give access to, that you trust in this case. It's not a secret. You could send it to the world forever, whatever it takes, right? There's nothing that somebody can do to get in. They need to be trusted so they can get access. And also, if you're dealing with a third party, maybe there's a partner that's managing your environment on your behalf, or a partner that has built a tool that you want to use, but it has to go through their environment. You can provide an extra level of security. We have this notion we call an external ID. So it's an additional information that they have to provide as part of assuming the role. If they don't, they can't assume the role. They cannot assume the role. That should be clear. So real quick, just walking through what this looks like, and I said, and Sean in the next session is going to talk more about this and get more into detail. But I said, we've got 2 accounts. We've got a dev account. We've got a prod account. Bob that I just created sits in the dev account, and there's data in a DynamoDB table that he needs to get access to validate that things are appropriate in the environment. Number 1, create the role. I need to find a trust policy. I need to find a policy of who I can trust. And this is where you're going to say, I trust IAM users in that account over there. You can see the account ID. It says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, et cetera. It's basically pointing to the devexample.com account. Then I need to define what is the policy. What can this role do once it's been assumed? What are the permissions it has? And if you look at it, it's a DynamoDB read-only. So it has get, batch get, query, scan. There's nothing writing, but it's a read-only policy for DynamoDB. So I'm now done in the account that has the data and that wants to provide access to somebody else outside of the account. The step I need to do in the first account where the user sits, remember, user does not have access by default, secure by default. You actually explicitly have to go and grant them access so they can do things. So I need to go in and define a policy that says Bob, in this case, can go in and assume the role that's called DDB-role over in the other account. And the flow would be Bob makes a call to assume the role with his credentials. What he gets back are the credentials, the temporary credentials for the role, and then he uses those credentials to call into DynamoDB. So there's a credential exchange that happens. You come in one set of credentials and you get another set of, temporary credentials back that you use. And you're going to see this as a common thread in the next 2 sessions when we talk about federation and also the deeper discussion about delegation, where there's an exchange of credentials that happens to enable this in our use case. So once again, I'm not going to show this. It's in more detail in the next sessions. I encourage you guys to go to it. Some cool demos there as well. This is also not something that is really unique to AWS, but it's something we recommend going in and rotating access keys, rotating credentials. The uniqueness to us is that there's two set of credentials. There's passwords and there's access keys. And rotating passwords, I sort of like showed you guys in a sense previously, right? You can set it up and force them to set the password next time they sign in. You can also set that it expires after X number of days, and they're going to be forced to reset the password. But you also have to do it for access keys. And the one I should mention here that it should be clear as well, I'll repeat it. If you're using roles for EC2, you don't have to worry about it on the instance. We will rotate those access keys several times a day. As long as you use the SDK, nothing changes on your side. You just wait and just let it roll. It will deal itself. So you want to enable credential rotation for users. You can do it with passwords. For passwords, you will set this policy, or you set the password policy I talked about, the little checkbox. It will do it for you. That does it for all users. If there's only a specific set of users, this is the policy that does it. There's one unique piece here that says username, which is a policy variable. And this allows you to create one policy that can be associated with many users, even though it's specific for that user. You don't want a user to be able to go and change a password on another user explicitly. So if you want to say that this user can only manage himself, this is the variable that you use in that case. Access keys looks very similar in policy. There's just different API calls. There's different actions that you need to take to change access keys. However, there are some interesting steps you need to go to, and you need to be careful. So a principal and user can have two access keys assigned and active at any given time, and the reason for that is to allow for key rotation. So when you're rotating access keys, make sure you have a set of access keys that are active. While they're still active, create the second pair of access keys, right? Go out and find all the places where the first set of access keys are being used. And this is the tricky part, because you might not always know, but at least it's a start. Those that you know about, go in and change the access key to the new ones. And here's the important piece. For the old access keys you have, don't delete them. Just flip the bit and set them to inactive and see what happens. Now you can tell pretty quickly if there's any application or anything out there that actually requires the new access keys in your environment. And once you've cleared out and you know exactly that nothing's broken, everything's working, then you can go and delete the first set of access keys. But there are some manual steps you have to go through, but this is the easiest way of doing it. If you have long-term access keys, and I'm going to keep repeating this over and over again, please rotate them on a regular basis. Yes, it is painful, but you should. We've had customers that have had access keys that are 7 or 8 years old, have never been rotated. And access keys are two components. There's an access keys and a secret, and that secret is equal to a password. And I don't know if you would want to have a password sit for 7 years and not have it rotated. So please have a process for rotating. Very good, best practice. Not going to do them on this one either. So conditions. So we've talked about being very granular. You can go in and control access to APIs, actions. You can control permissions down to resources. You can also add conditions so you can be even more granular in your control and what you're doing with access. And this is a little bit up to you how you want to control your environment. You can enable it for any service API. All service APIs support conditions. And it minimizes your chance for anybody going in and doing something accidental, which might be good. Use the one when applicable. There's two types of conditions to be aware of. They're what we call AWS-wide. So these are conditions that that are applicable for all services. And I'll show a couple of them in a minute. And then they're service-specific. There are conditions that are specific to that service. So you need to know about those. You have to look in the documentation for those. A couple of the cross ones that are across all services are the ones that are up here. So MFA, SSL, and source IP, or in different terms. You can require that a user is authenticated with an MFA device in order for an action to be allowed. Or you can require that for a user to be able to perform an action, they have come in over a secure channel, SSL. Or use source IP. I will not allow somebody to go and call this API unless they're coming in from a source IP that happens to be within my enterprise network. You can combine these as well. So you can have a policy as well. A user cannot go in and do terminate instance unless they're authenticated through MFA, they're coming in through a secure channel, and it happens to be on the enterprise network. It's up to you how you want to model it and how you explicitly want it to work. So this one I will demo. Quickly look here who I'm signed in as. There we go. Anders, okay. So we'll go back to IAM. So we had Bob in this case, and if you remember Bob, we created before, he had very little access. If we look at the permissions, he's part of the S3 read-only. There's no other permissions associated with him. Now I happen to have another group that I created that's called MFA Terminate, and I'll add Bob to this group. And if we go and look, I have to go into groups here, sorry. So really what this is, so this is in addition to the S3 policy it has. So what this policy says is, at the bottom it says, allow anything to EC2. You can do anything in EC2, whatever he wants. However, I'm going to deny access as long as he's not authenticated with MFA. And this is really what that condition says. All right. So let's see if this is true or not. I'm going to cancel this. And so we sign in as Bob, go to EC2. And you see now it doesn't say access denied anymore. Now I actually see pieces. And I don't have a running instance, so let's quickly launch one so we can play around a little bit. And as I said, I have all the permissions in the world. Let's do this. Yeah, let's just pick that one. So you notice previously Bob didn't have any permissions. He got the permissions just because I added him to the group. And the instance is launching. Okay. Let's see if I can terminate the instance. You now see I got access denied, right? So basically I had all access to EC2, but I didn't have the MFA access. It basically says you're not authorized. Now all the things you see down here, the gunk, is not something that's readable. This is what I read on Sundays instead of the CloudTrail log. But there's actually a way where you can take, there's EC2 support, we support a way when you can take this information and you call in and we will decrypt this or crack this for you. You can actually tell explicitly what the problem is. It's one of those we don't want to devolve in detail why the user doesn't have access. It's more like you don't have permissions. But as a coder, when you're writing an application, you can use this information as a way of determining more information. So
when you're bored with reading JSON?
Yep, you read this. Carter and I read this on a daily basis. So let me then quickly do this. I have to sign in as Anders again, just to show that I'm not. And of course we need to have MFA. Just to prove that I'm not, that this actually works. Oh, I'm going to select Bob. Security credentials. Manage Mfa Device. Once again, bring up your cameras. I've actually done this once, and one guy in the audience was calling out the numbers for me. I didn't have to do anything specific. Then he came up afterwards and said, I can now steal everything you have in your account. And I said, no, you can't. I still got my password. And just for everybody that's security conscious in here, yes, I'm going to change all this after the demo. Oh, thank you. I appreciate the thought. We have to wait for the second one, so. Does that need to sign in again as Bob? Ooh. I can use the same code, it didn't expire. So now lets me in, I got in as Bob, I can go back to EC2. As you saw the last time, I tried to terminate the instance, wasn't very successful. And now it actually terminates the instance. Now the thing you see now, I've shown you this through the console. With the policy just enforced, it doesn't matter which entry point Bob comes in. If it's through the API or the console through the CLI, it's always going to be enforced. So if you have information that is very sensitive, or if it's machines that you only want to have a specific set of people be able to manage, this is a very good way of doing it, controlling. So they actually require that them use their MFA. So we don't have to watch this shut down. So let's go back to the presentation. Number 11 or number 10 or whatever way we count it as, this is a big one. Don't use root. All the things that I've shown so far should have convinced you not to use root. So when you create a new account with AWS, one of the things that account does, it is your business relationship with AWS. It's also the way you pay your bill. But what it also gives you is credentials, and you can use those credentials to do anything that I've shown so far, accessing services, et cetera. But you cannot control, there's no policy you can enforce on root. Root is God in the account. So what we strongly encourage, and this is really one of the more important best practices, don't use root. Lock it away. Delete your secret, delete your access keys. Don't ever use them. Put an MFA device, enforce MFA on it. Don't use a smartphone. Use a hard device like a display card or something, and lock that away in a safe for the cases where you might potentially want to use the root account, but you should never have to use it. Everything should be able to be done through an IAM user. So this is a whole list that we walked through, and I said the first 5 or first 6, there's nothing really new there other than what you should be doing normally in your operating system. The rest are things that are very specific to AWS, given that we have different types of credentials. We've got roles for EC2 and the way you share or gain access or delegate access between accounts. And I think I actually have time for questions. There might not be any questions. It's a question in the back. Today, no. When you're enabling it, you need to have the device with you. So if you have an MFA, if you have a hard Gemalto tokens, you could do it in advance and then send out the device. If you're using a smartphone, they essentially need to stand next to you. We know about it, so yeah.
The second one is around the protection of keys in a continuous deployment environment. And it wasn't covered here, but just the protection of that. It lives in, today for us, it lives in some code. It gets rotated on a regular basis, but it lives in the code process.
Is that so? When you say in the code, is it for applications running on EC2?
Applications running in EC2.
Then you should use, this is one of the examples I brought up was roles for EC2. You should not be having access keys in your code at all. If you're using the SDK, you can take out essentially anything that has to do with the key management piece. That will be handled for you. And also, if you're using auto-scaling, when you create a launch group, you can associate the role with the launch group, and all the instances that get launched in that launch group will be launched with that role. So you can scale up to 10,000 instances, and it's the same role with permissions. And if you want to change permissions, you do it on a role, then it's fairly instantaneous to take effect. Sean was sitting up front. We'll be covering this in more detail in the next presentation, so after this one. But use roles for EC2. It will solve your problem. It makes life much easier because also if you got it in your, as you said, trying to rotate it and it's in your code, it becomes really hard, and remembering to rotate it in all the different places and all those pieces. And this is what we want to do with roles, just simplify it. So, other questions?
Any best practices the way namespaces work?
There is no single namespace. What are you looking for specifically?
I think maybe I'll wait for the federation.
Okay. There is, when you name, so users and groups and roles with regards to naming are unique within the account. So you could have a user called Anders, but only one. But if I got two accounts, I can have two users that I name Anders in account A and Anders in account B. They're different principals because they have a unique ID that we deal with under the scenes, so to speak. But naming-wise, they have the same name. The only thing that is globally unique really today that I can remember on top of my head is S3 buckets. Right, a bucket has to be unique across the board. That's one. And the second one I actually had, I don't know if you guys noticed the URL that I was using was signed in, it says Viking. That is an alias you associate with account. You don't have to create the alias. You could have use the account ID, but that's a 12-digit number that nobody ever remembers. You can create that alias, but it's also unique in AWS. It's something that has to be unique across the board. So if somebody's taking something that you really want, like Viking, sorry, it's taken.
My thought was that the government or financial scenario where you want to be specific, you want to have a specific namespace on the top versus using a general namespace.
Yeah, right now it's not there, but you should see if that's something that's covered in the following sessions when we talk about federation, et cetera. So. No more questions? Good. Thank you very much.